Now, in Canada, this is an article from 2018 which says, or 17, which says that Canada is the number one in terms of cashless societies. It's not entirely true, right? So we saw another statistic that Sweden has less cash in circulation than Canada, or less cash usage. But in terms of debit payments, Canada for sure is quite high up. And that may surprise many people. If you come from India or from China, you wonder, well, but WeChat Pay is further ahead, is much easier to use. And then I can point to many problems here where this may be a little misleading. So, for instance, 71% of all small and medium enterprises still use checks as a means of payment, and often as a major means of payment. 57% of all corporates use checks as a means of payment. So these are larger companies. And the average cost for a check is $15. So that's a lot of money that is getting lost there in the process. And you get to ask yourself the question of why is that the case, right? So last year, this is one my colleague Wendy Rottenberg, you had that that were about 734 million checks were used for a total of $4 trillion. How is this possible? Right? So how can we say that we're in a modern payment system where people still use dead trees to send money around? That makes no sense, right? So the question is really, are people well serviced? And I'll give you an example here for myself. I spent a year in Denmark from 2014 to 2015. And this white thing that you see there, that's my bicycle. Now this is a very fancy bicycle. It has an electric engine, and if anybody wants to know, this bike weighs 60 kilos. With my kids in it, it's over 100 kilos. So schlepping a 100 kilo bike around is a lot of work. So that not even levels the playing field. But it's a very nice and fancy bike. So you can't see it, but my two kids were sitting there in the front. Now that bike had a value, and I sold it for the equivalent of $5,000. So, you can buy a small car, not in Denmark, right? Because in Denmark you pay 180% tax, but here in Canada, sure, you can get that. So the problem was though, I had no idea how these things work in Denmark. People don't use checks in Denmark. Because I was about to leave the country, I didn't want to have $5,000 in cash in my bank account. I didn't want to have $5,000 in cash running around, and it's actually almost impossible to get that much money. So here we are. I want to send the bikes on the weekend, and I had no idea how to get paid. And the guy who I sold it to said, that's not going to be a problem. Here we go. Took his app, took my cell number, and sent me $5,000 in a spot. And while he pressed the button, I could see it appear in my bank account. So the transfer was instantaneous for an amount of $5,000. Now, you can use email transfers in Canada, but by no means for an amount of $5,000, right? And, it is still a rather clunky process, which is difficult to set up, and it takes longer to do. So, and by the way, that was 2014. Email transfers working well is only something which happened in the last 2 years or so. So in other words, what I did there, I couldn't do here. And this is a standard thing that people do there all the time. Now, let's forget about me because, I could have dealt with this problem, generally speaking. Let's look at really people for whom it matters in terms of their real life, right? So, in the US, there's data from 2015 from the Financial Protection Bureau, and basically that tries to assess the extent to which the underbanked and the unbanked are suffering from slow payments. So the idea is, so basically look at the fees that this part of the population paid. And this is something on the order of $140 billion that they paid. Now, here's why and what feeds into this. And slow payments is one of the things that matters the most. So people had to cash their checks using cash checkers. So this is basically you go to a store and they give them the check, and then they give you cash in return, and they cash the check on your behalf, but they take a cut off the top. That alone accounts for about $2 billion of fees. Then there is payday lenders, where people basically need their money. People need their money right away, so they take their paycheck, or they get a cash advance on their upcoming paycheck, and that alone accounts for fees of up to $7 billion. And then they also go to their legacy banks, where they have to pay overdraft fees on the order of $24 billion. So if you add up these numbers, this is over $30 billion that people paid just in order to get faster payments. So just let's do a rule of thumb, right? So it's about 30 million people in the US are considered to be unbanked or underbanked, right? And so they paid a total of $30 billion worth of fees. So that's what, $300 a person, or not $300 a person, whatever it is. Oh, my math is off. Whatever the number is, it's a large number. Pause. So let's just do the numbers, right? So there's about 30 billion. Let's just look at the plain numbers. There's about 30 million underbanked or unbanked people in the US. That's the estimate. Could be a larger number. Let's go with 30 million, right? And the fees that they paid here, as you can see, they accumulate to roughly $30 billion. So it means that all of these underbanked people paid roughly on average $1,000 worth of fees a year. Now, for those people who are already underbanked, this is an enormous amount of money, right? So if people make $20,000 a year and they have to pay $1,000 just for the banks, just for the convenience of having their money, just for the slowness of the system, that's an enormous amount. And this is just wrong. It's just plainly wrong, if you ask me. Now, you ask, why do they need the money immediately? Well, there's frequent situations. And I had conversations with friends of mine when they were, who have faced these situations when they were of lower income. And when they worked in certain types of industries. So sometimes people get paid with check on the 30th. There could be a Friday. It takes until Wednesday or Thursday until the check clears. And so your rent may be due on the 1st. And so you need to have an advance, otherwise you're facing other fees, you face penalties, you face all kinds of problems. So fast payments matter to people. Now, we talked already about international remittances. The average fee, depending on which means you use, went down over the last few years from 10 to 8%. But if you go to a financial institution, you want to do bank to bank, which is arguably the most convenient and secure, you're still paying something on the order of 11%. Here I put the number of 10%. The numbers are high, right? Because it's after-tax income that poor people pay. So we're talking about huge numbers affecting poor people. In other words, the clunkiness of our system is not something that is an inconvenience for the people who, are wealthy as it is. It really matters for the people who are on the weaker end of the economic spectrum. But not only there, it also affects businesses. It affects, therefore, the ability for businesses to hire workers. It affects the availability of businesses to do new innovations, create growth in the economy. So here's an example this is from a case study from Ernst & Young, and they basically say, well, look, in order to track our payments and to know which comes where, you had to increase your, the availability of your working capital. Tracking the payments took a very long time. And as a consequence of that, they had an average annual cost of something like $500,000 for a small to medium-sized enterprise. Now, think about that. That's like 3 to 4, well-paying jobs that are used, that are not used because people have to monitor and track payments. So, bottom line is, suboptimal payment processing is estimated by Ernst & Young to cost Canadian businesses roughly $2.9 to $6.5 billion a year. So by no means can we say that we are in a state where payments are servicing the Canadian public.